Need a Wi Fi scanner and survey tool that won't kill your budget? Try Wi Fi Scanner for Windows. It's an all in one tool to explore Wi Fi access points, test speed, and perform active and passive surveys. Built by Wi Fi engineers for Wi Fi engineers. Visit wifiscanner.com to start your free trial today.
Hi, guys. Welcome to a brand new episode of the Clear to Send podcast. I'm here today with Roel. Hey, Roel, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you.
And today we're talking about network automation, and we have Chris Grundemann with us. Hey, Chris, how are you?
Very good. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for joining us. And we wanted to talk about a forum that you initiated around network automation, and we found that it was quite interesting to see these type of discussions happening in the industry. So we wanted to kind of have you on and have a chat about it, so you can have some time to talk about it and present what you guys are doing.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So
looking forward to it.
Really happy to have you. Do you want to introduce yourself? Tell us, what you do, where you're based out, and I guess how you started in the whole network automation world.
Sure. Yeah. I'll try to keep it pretty brief. I've been kind of on a circuitous journey for 20 years or so now, I guess, maybe a little over 20 years. Although that sounds really weird to say. It's also weird to say turn of the century, but that's when I got started in the early 2000s. My first kind of real network engineering job, interestingly, was actually tied to wireless in some ways. I was helping build a wireless internet service provider. And at that time, we were using unlicensed frequency. We were basically using Wi-Fi, although there was a protocol kind of suite. This guy called it CarlNet. I believe his name was Carl. And it was a shift off of Wi-Fi. So it was using, open frequencies, the unlicensed frequencies, the same like 2.4 that everybody was using at that time. But it did, it was doing a polling algorithm instead of the normal kind of Wi-Fi setup. So it's kind of more like TDM over Wi-Fi. But anyway, it worked really well for fixed wireless. And that's what we were doing in Colorado, outside of Denver, before DSL and cable internet had penetrated out into the neighborhoods that were, sprawling out into the woods and mountains and stuff. And so we went out there and would go in neighborhoods and find the house on the tallest hill and see if we could pull a T1 in there and put an antenna on their roof, and then kind of go door to door pre-selling internet service and then try and get people signed up, and then put, antennas on their house and get it all going. Eventually we had wireless backhaul to tie kind of these little islands of communities together into one, and got a little bit more bandwidth in there. And then, of course, as soon as it was getting really cool, DSL and cable internet came into those neighborhoods and was cheaper and easier and faster and all that stuff. So we ended up pivoting and went into Denver and did we worked with Dragonwave and built we called it air fiber, but just a ring of microwave radios around Denver to provide Metro Ethernet services for businesses wirelessly. At the very beginnings of kind of the Metro Ethernet fad. So that's where I got started. And it was funny because then when I went into telco after that, everybody else had kind of cut their teeth on Sonnet and ATM and frame relay and all. I knew nothing about any of those things. I was like, I know how to do antennas, man. I don't know about all these wires and things. So it's pretty interesting.
So you did the reverse path of any Wi-Fi guys. You started with the wireless and ended up on the wired network.
Exactly.
Awesome. So what do you do today?
So these days I'm more of an entrepreneur and a consultant. I do, dabble in a few different things. I work with one company called Full Control, which is focusing on automation of interconnection specifically. So making BGP easier for folks and making internet exchange work more smoothly. I also do the podcast network, the Imposter Syndrome Network podcast, which takes up quite a bit of time and is a lot of fun to do. And then the newest thing right now is the Network Automation Forum, which, the idea is to be exactly that, a forum for discussion, kind of a salon in the old style, where we want to just, be a kind of, the watering hole where everyone gathers around to talk about automation. And the impetus there is we've been talking about automation as an industry for at least 15 years, maybe 20 years. That first network I was talking about, that WISP, we actually built that all on our own kind of bridging router Linux boxes that was all kind of homebrewed with Perl scripts and a bunch of duct tape and baling wire. So I kind of started with software defined networks, not necessarily the way that we talk about SDN these days, but definitely the network was defined by software, and have been kind of disappointed, as I think a lot of other folks have, in the lack of progress we've made towards kind of more full network automation, network orchestration, even observability. A lot of these things are starting to happen in more and more ways, but there's a lot of difficulties as well. And so the Network Automation Forum, we're hoping to kind of be a neutral kind of focus point for that community and kind of jump into that conversation and help propel it forward and turn it from talking into doing as much as we can.
So when you say it's a forum, are you, but like, how do you guys communicate together? Like, I know you guys have a conference coming up, but do you also have like some sort of website that people go to, or a Slack group or a Discord or whatever? Like, how do you guys communicate on that topic?
Yeah. So just starting out on a lot of this stuff, yeah, we are really heads down focused. The first thing we're doing is this event. We're calling it AutoCon 0. We added a number to it because we hope that this will continue. We hope it's going to be a success, and we're going to keep doing more of these, either once or twice a year. We've already gotten some requests to do one in either the UK or EU next year, in addition to the one in the US. So we'll see about that. But yeah, right now, there is a website. It's networkautomation.forum. You can find more information there. There is a mailing list, and that's kind of where we're right now kind of gathering folks together on that mailing list. And or go right ahead and register for the event as well. Registration's open. The early bird pricing runs through the rest of this month. We're pretty sure we're going to sell out, maybe even before the early bird expires. So we'll see what happens there. But the event is kind of going to be the foundational moment, I think, where we're going to kind of kick all this off and figure out what the community wants and needs. So I can definitely see us moving folks to a Slack channel. That'll probably happen even before the event, just so that people can have kind of that more open communication in a vendor neutral space. But beyond that, again, it's going to be kind of up to what folks want and need. We're going to bring as many people as we can together in the event in Denver in November for AutoCon 0 and talk about some of this stuff. Really, we're really trying to focus on the question of why haven't we seen full adoption of network automation yet? I think there's some good answers to that, but hopefully we can overcome most of them. And then, the Network Automation Forum will kind of fill in the gaps wherever there are. I think there's plenty of standards bodies and things like that out there, but maybe best practices, maybe just, again, facilitating debate and conversation. We want to fit in and figure out where those leverage points are.
It sounds like what we do in the Wi-Fi industry a little bit with our conferences, right? Because there's no like standard on how to do a proper site survey either, right? So sometimes we try to kind of gather and organize things a little bit more. So we have like best practices that people can follow, and we can try to figure out, the trends and in the industry, and what to work on, I guess, what to focus on.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think that's a good point, because a lot of this will probably initially be driven by vendors, and it's not necessarily from the perspective of an end user who's operating these networks. Maybe some of those discussions don't even make it to how a vendor would implement it. And then you have how vendor A does it, how vendor B does it. Again, trying to figure out something where the users can at least implement it with, no matter what vendor you're using, that network automation could be the same or follow the same set of standards.
Absolutely. I think that, I think vendors have a huge role to play and need a seat at the table here. But I also think that in many ways, vendors have kind of gotten in the way of automation in some cases. Maybe not intentionally, maybe sometimes intentionally. I don't know. But I think, standardizing interfaces, standardizing an approach. I really feel like network engineering in general is kind of at the place that manufacturing was in the middle of like the 19th century. So like 1850s. Right before, the archetypical one is Henry Ford and the assembly line, but just manufacturing in general becoming more automated, more standardized. I really feel like network engineering is kind of at that inflection point where we're still all kind of, spending years learning the CLI as craftsmen and artisans, and then like hand chiseling out these little parts and putting them together to build these networks. But if you take the network apart, none of those parts actually work in a different network. It's all very custom and very bespoke. And some of that's because it's, we've got different vendors across the network, or between my network and your network. Some of them is because within that vendor, I've got different models or different software versions. But some of it, even if I have a very homogeneous network from a, hardware and software perspective, I can still configure, OSPF. There's, I don't know if there's a million different ways, but there's at least, a couple dozen ways to configure OSPF on my network. Same thing with BGP and all these other things, where my configuration may be a little bit different than Sam or Joe or Melissa or whoever else is configuring this thing. And so getting to that standardization point, I think is one of the first steps to getting towards automation personally.
Yeah.
Now, I could be proven wrong in that, but I think that we really need to get on the same page with kind of how we build certain parts of networks.
Yeah, I agree.
Especially in many cases.
I totally agree with what you're saying, because the disparity of how you would do it between different networks and different vendors is a hurdle, right? And it often will be one of those talking points where, okay, if we're going to upgrade the network, the automation piece is considered there, but then also like, hey, we have vendor A, vendor B gets us what we want, but can we integrate the two using automation? And then if you introduce another vendor in the future, or even a different model, like you were saying in the future, will that automation still be similar? You will still follow those standards? And then when we talk about Wi-Fi, like, can we tie those automation pieces as well to the Wi-Fi network with that separate vendor? I think that's mainly the biggest hurdles. And in my point of view is disparity between vendors and how vendors want to do it their way, right? They like to have their own bread and butter because they're trying to make a profit.
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of those discussions go is, I'm going to go at vendor A, so I have to follow how that vendor does automation.
It kind of goes against the standards in networking, like we're supposed to have standards so anyone can kind of use the protocol on any platform, right? But maybe vendors, they want to do, just like what they did with networking. They want to come up with their own way and then push it and say, oh, my way becomes the standards. Let everyone else use it. Like, Cisco did with other different protocol back in the day. So maybe that's kind of like their strategy. But I think I'm actually working on the initiative that's called Open Intent that's driven by Janek Snyder at Google. But we're trying to kind of define a schema for to kind of structure data whenever we have to send data from like a Wi-Fi application to like a Wi-Fi vendor type of deal. So we can have like a defined way of doing things, and we're trying to have the vendor on board we try to sell the idea to the vendors so they can implement on their way. So it makes everything easier, and all of that, inter-vendor communication way easier for us, even between vendors that do not compete, against each other. It could be like a Wi-Fi design tool, and then, and a networking equipment vendor, or, an installer tool or whatever. So it's interesting, and there's definitely work to do, but maybe we can get inspired by other industry. Like I don't know it, well enough, but I'm sure other industry went through that process before, maybe in the manufacturing, was with all of they're going through like the whole digital transition right now as well. So maybe we can kind of find some synergies between our industries. I know networking is, I think one of the hurdle as well is networking is very critical. And it's one of the things that, if it works well, no one notice, but if it doesn't work, it's like the end of the world. And, oh, we're losing millions, and, come spend your weekend and fix that issue. So I think the network engineers, they kind of like, okay, we have to think about this. We need to make sure it works well, because if it doesn't, then we'll have bigger issues. So maybe that's one of the hurdle as well.
For sure. And I think, even it's not even necessarily just different industries. I think, if we just look, over probably a couple cubes down in a lot of places where the folks who are running databases or storage arrays or just, server farms or whatever it is, kind of the compute and storage side of the house, a lot of that, and then especially the developers beyond them, have been doing, a lot of automation for a long time, that just hasn't kind of crept over into networking. And there's definitely some reasons for it, right? I think one is certainly the fact that network hardware tends to be different, right? It's not all x86. There's actually different, FPGAs or whatever kind of chips are going into these devices. They're going to be different between different vendors and even within the same vendor. So that there's a hardware component there that makes it a little bit harder. The OS component, I think you're right, that the fundamental nature of the network makes it harder. You kind of want to stick with what works, because, like you said, right, if it blows up, you don't want to be the one who took down the network, because then everything else stops working, right? All the applications, the storage, the data doesn't get accessible. None of the users can use their network. It becomes a pretty big deal. Yeah, so there's definitely some reasons for it, but I think a lot of it is surmountable, right? I think we can get past it, but it is going to take a cohesive effort. And I think, rolling back a little bit, right? Definitely vendors want to differentiate themselves, right? If you're selling a switch or a router or a wireless access point or whatever it is, you want to have something that makes you different, if not better than the competition. And I think, in a lot of networks, it's similar, not all, but if you're working on a CDN or an ISP, especially, right? Your network is actually part of your business, and you may want to do things differently than everybody else to differentiate. And so standardization becomes hard at that level too, because maybe you do want to use a weird network architecture or use BGP communities in a different way, specifically to gain some either advantage or at least difference from the other folks. And so that's kind of happening at every level. One of the things that I think is happening too is we've seen a lot more kind of professional services organizations or consultants come in to help kind of figure out the glue in between all of this, right? Because you can't really ask your vendor for automation because they're not necessarily going to help you automate the other vendor stuff that's definitely in your network. Your team probably doesn't know everything they need to know. So there's a lot more consultants popping up to do this. And kind of figuring out, okay, well, how do I glue, a source of truth into this, heterogeneous network that includes a WAN and cloud networks now, and a local network and wireless and not, and kind of figure it all out and kind of put the pieces together. So I think we need all those folks to come together to really hash this out and figure out what are the things we can standardize on. Are there interfaces we can all agree to use? Right? Is it netconf? Is it Yang? There's people who kind of are yes and no on both of those things. Is it GNMI for streaming telemetry, or is it something else? What are the things we can actually agree on to kind of create those at least high level standards where I can drop into any network and kind of understand how to automate it. And we can talk about these things between organizations without having to kind of tell you everything about my network so that you can help me at all before I even can ask a question, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what you're saying is interesting, because that's kind of like what I do when I work on those projects. And also I found myself being like the interface between, because sometimes the customer do have developers, but these developers, like, they're really good at programming, but they don't really understand the network piece or the Wi-Fi piece. So I can like act as like the bridge between, the network team and the programmers, and and trying to have everything on the same page and make them going to the right direction. So I feel that bringing automation to networking also creates new roles in the organization, right? So you mentioned consultant, but maybe long term we'll have a new role, like, I don't know, maybe like a DevOps, NetOps, or I forgot how they call it, but we'll have maybe like new engineers in the organization that can actually take on that role of implementing the because when you talk to all the network engineers, sometimes the feedback we get is, I don't really want to get into it. I'm too old. I'm about to retire. I like what I do. I'm sure you guys have heard it. But then on the other end, when you get like fresh guys out of a university, now they learn about programming at school. So they come in and they know what, all of the language, they know what JSON is, Yang, whatever. So they feel way more comfortable kind of jumping into it and helping the network team.
They're automation first is what you're saying. They what can I automate, and then figure out what are the pieces that we can't automate right now, but work towards automating.
Yeah, and it makes like it's an interesting time for the industry. So I think the forum has a place, definitely. And it's interesting you're talking about the the open. Have you guys looked at the open config? Like, is it something that's not standardized? Or I thought it would be like open config is like the way to go, but maybe I don't know about the alternatives.
We'll be right back to the episode. Do you need a tool that offers seamless Wi-Fi analysis and troubleshooting? Look no further to Wi-Fi Scanner for Windows. It's a versatile 3-in-1 tool. Discover Wi-Fi access points with ease, assess speed and performance accurately, and conduct detailed active and passive Wi-Fi surveys seamlessly. It works perfectly with the internal card of your Windows device. The Wi-Fi Scanner Copilot feature is ready to troubleshoot common issues related to connectivity, performance, security, and configurations. Broaden your reach by analyzing remote networks with Optify and WLAN-PI integration. Dive into beacon information or delve deeper by opening wireless PCAP files. Visit wifiscanner.com and download a free trial today.
I mean, it definitely is kind of a bit of a de facto standard for sure. There are some
Mhm.
limitations there, just like anything, right? I mean, just like, if you go back to SNMP, the standard MIB set was pretty good, but then
Mhm.
every vendor had their kind of custom MIBs to add on to that for their differentiation and their features. And I think OpenConfig is similar. One of
Yeah.
the things I just recently ran into with OpenConfig is the set of address families that they have defined isn't all the address families that I use in some of the networks I work on. And so, there's a
Mhm.
limitation there where if I try to use the OpenConfig address families, I'm limited because they don't have like multicast VPN family, which is something that gets used in some networks. And I think that's always, there's always going to be some of those limitations and stretches and things where we've got to kind of push the boundaries a little bit. But hopefully, you can get that core set of functionality
Yeah.
at least.
So
Yeah. Go ahead, Raw.
I was going to say at the network automation forum, what are some of the initial discussions you're going to have with the people that attend to kind of drive this community and industry further into network automation?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. So, like I said, I mean, step one is kind of bringing all these stakeholders together. And then a big part of it, at least initially, is looking at the challenges, which some of the challenges, and a lot of the ones we've kind of touched on here, are technical, right? Whether it's hardware, software, or just general config things, there are some technical limitations here, standard interfaces, that kind of stuff. But I think, and I think a lot of people agree, a lot of the challenges to network automation have nothing to do with the technology at all. It's a business case issue, right? Can I get my boss or my boss's boss or whoever it is who signs the checks to sign off on spending time and resources on developing automation? It's also just a political thing, right? Is it the developer team or the network engineering team that's going to build these tools, and who's going to maintain them? And how do you negotiate that?
Mhm.
Maybe nobody wants to, maybe somebody has to, right? Or maybe everybody wants to, and you've got to figure out how to kind of split that baby. Things like that. And then, as you talked about, right, there's some folks who are just kind of waiting to retire. There's other folks who just really identify their skill set with their knowledge of the CLI. And if I spent, 10 years going to get my CCIE, of course I'm attached to that. And if you say, you know what, I'm going to give you a GUI instead. Yeah, that, there's some personal things you got to get over to get through that and be like, okay, you know what? I am going to put down, these artisanal tools and jump on the assembly line, right? It's a big transition personally for folks. So, we want to talk about a lot of that stuff as well, right? Just not just the technology, but what else is potentially in the way. Also, the buzzword lately is AI. I do think that it may be overhyped at the moment, but I think there's a place for artificial intelligence, machine learning in particular, in taking automation to the next level. And especially on the observability side, right? I think that's a big piece too. I'm really interested in kind of closed loop automation, at least eventually, right? And understanding, okay, how do we get the observability we need, the telemetry, monitoring, alerting, whatever else it might be, to feed back into this automation system so that it can actually maintain state, even if it's perturbed, right? Just like you see like the Boston Robotics videos where like you push the robot, it holds its ground. I want my network to do that, right? I want a link to fail and for the thing to kind of figure it out, right? An AP fails or falls off the ceiling or power goes out. How can can power levels automatically adjust or channels change or whatever to account for that without having to wake somebody up at 3 a.m. To figure that out. So definitely getting that closed loop and getting observability in there is going to be another part of the conversation as well. And just I'm a big fan of bright spots as well. Let's talk about what's worked and how do we do more of that. I think is going to be a big part of this too. I don't want to focus too much on the negatives and what's missing. Let's focus on the folks who have really pushed the envelope and built very automated networks. There's quite a few of them out there. On the agenda, we've already got somebody from Major League Baseball. We've got somebody from New York Times. We've got a few other folks from enterprises and service providers. ESNet, which is an education and science network that's done an amazing job building kind of a source of truth-based, intent-driven network automation system kind of from scratch. So there's folks out there who have done this. It's possible, right? Even with all the limitations we just talked about, like you can do this. We were writing expect scripts, 20 years ago to make this work, kind of. So it is possible. And how do we replicate that, over and over again? So that's going to be one of the big focuses is, let's not try to tell people how to do things. Let's talk about what's worked and then see how we can replicate that in different environments.
Do you find that most of the network automation effort is coming from the vendor today, or do you find that it's more coming from like the end customer who are trying to find a way to kind of glue everything together?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think it takes many forms. I do
Hmm.
think that finally we're starting to see more of a pull from operators who are realizing, like, I can't keep up with the amount of devices and the amount of networks I have to manage without having some kind of automation. And so you're starting to see this pull. I think, previously it was more driven by vendors. And honestly, right, if you look at, the history of automation, some of the really early stuff was just as much as like, stacking switches, right? Taking 5 switches and turning them into one bundle that I could manage as a unit. That's the automation coming from a vendor. And it's useful, right? I mean, it definitely works and it's helpful. And it got us a long way. And a lot of IDFs and MDFs, right, really helped to make that management possible. It also means that you can't add a switch from another vendor to that stack. So there's a reason for the vendor to do it that way, right? And so I think some of those vendor-driven automation things that have happened over time have gone down that path of kind of backing you into a corner a little bit. So you got to watch out for that. I do think that that's shifted quite a bit. We've seen, disaggregated networking and open networking, and a lot of things kind of blew the doors open a little bit. Even OpenFlow, while it didn't really get as far as a lot of people hoped it would, that whole conversation on SDN, I think, has woken people up to, maybe I don't need control plane and forwarding plane separation, but what I do need is more automation and more programmatic control of my network. And so I think we are seeing it kind of, come to more of an equilibrium for sure. And as we talked about, there's also new vendors in the mix, right? These consultancies that are either just coming in to help glue it all together or are spinning out and building tools, right? You see, Netbox Labs now is a company built around Netbox, which is a really cool source of truth that a lot of people use. Obviously, and then the network to code guys, they forked that and they have their Nautobot, which is also kind of, building its own ecosystem. Those two groups tend to throw stones at each other a little bit, but those are new vendors, I would say, right? Netbox Labs and network to code with Nautobot and Netbox as products that are both also open source that, are driving the industry in a new way. So, there is that vendor driven automation as well, which is totally different than I think the switch manufacturers or router manufacturers driving automation.
And in networking, we've been used to have like the IEEE come up with different standards and kind of organized everything. And of course, people working for the IEEE, they usually come from vendors and maybe chip manufacturers and all of this. But do you feel like the IEEE should also be responsible for taking on, kind of the standardizing of network automation, or do you think like it's out of scope and it's closer to like, like the programming standards? Do you know what I mean?
I do. I don't know that I have a good answer. I mean, it's definitely interesting, right? I do think that the IEEE, mostly stays focused on kind of the hardware bits, like the actual electrical engineering pieces, which makes sense.
Hmm.
So I think, there's definitely a place there, but I think some of that is looking more at like things like P4, right? And programming languages in the ASICs,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff, which I don't know that end users or, network operators, people who architect and build networks ever care about that too much. The vendors
Hmm.
may want to use that, right? Additional flexibility in their tools to make their tools or their products more flexible. But I do think they have a place to play in this. The IETF, obviously, which is where a lot of the IP protocol standards have come from, in the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is kind of OSPF, BGP, IP itself, right? A lot of these things, I think there's room to play there, right? That's where Yang is happening. That's where NetConf kind of came out of. So they definitely have a role to play, I think, in some of these standardized interfaces as well, and looking at it. There's a whole stack, right? And then if you look previously in the past, there's been groups like, it's not necessarily as much automation, but the Metro Ethernet Forum was one that kind of created and kind of started creating reference architectures and stuff. There's a few folks today. There's some groups out there that are doing this today, where they're kind of looking at different swaths of the network and from different industry perspectives and looking at how do we kind of more standardize and build practices around that and stuff. So it's definitely happening. I think it is going to be a layer cake forever, right? There's definitely going to be these kind of different organizations involved at different places. Like I said, I think, Network Automation Forum, we're trying to kind of just be the icing up on top that really kind of allows operators to communicate with each other and share best practices in whatever way makes sense, on top of all these other standards that are out there and usable. Because that's the other thing too, right? You get this problem. I think there's some cartoon about it where I think it might have been an XKCD, right? Where the guy says, okay, so the problem is we've got 12 competing standards and nobody knows which one to use. So we're going to build a unifying standard that everyone will use. And then the result is 13 competing standards that no one knows which one to use, right? And so, you've got to have, at some point, you've got to have this next level of like, okay, the standards are great, but like, which ones are we going to decide collectively as an industry to use? And that's really powerful as well, I think.
Yeah, that has a lot of power right there, because if you get the operators together and they decide what's going to be used, and then they themselves share this information with other people, like, hey, here's how we're building best practices around these sets of standards, or this standard itself, then that will help kind of drive the industry towards one direction versus having all these different stems out everywhere, right? And I think that's always that's where our industry tends to go, is like some go here, some go there, and then all of a sudden this dies, and now people are left with, well, what do I do now with
Yeah.
this? But
And then if you start getting involved with one standard and you spend time learning it, then it's hard for you to kind of look the
go
other
do another one.
direction
Yeah.
and have to do the same work again. So I can feel the frustration from that standpoint for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So about the event. So you guys
Yeah.
have the event in November.
Yeah.
How can people get involved? Like if they want to attend or present something, or like what's the process that you guys have?
Yeah. So the call for speakers actually ended August 15th. So we just announced the high level agenda. Not everything is on there yet, but you can go to networkautomation.forum. It's /event info, but if you just go to networkautomation.forum, you can kind of find everything. There's a button in the menu there for AutoCon 0, which has the event info and all that stuff. And it's got kind of, a list of some of the speakers that have been confirmed and the high level agenda. There's a register now button up in the top right corner where you can register and buy your tickets. Like I said, right now they're still on super early bird pricing right now for the rest of this month. So after September, the price will go up again. And like I said, we may not even make it that far. We may get we may sell out before then, because we are going to cap the event because we want to make sure that it is somewhat intimate, right? We're going to make sure that there's no more than 400 people at the event, because we want to make sure that conversations can happen, that it doesn't get too big. That there's not an ability for us to kind of share ideas and kind of have that mixing going. Maybe in the future we'll be able to get bigger and do multiple tracks, that kind of thing. But for right now, we really want to have everybody in the room hearing the same things, asking the same questions, that kind of stuff. There's also, if you can't be in Denver on the 13th and 14th of November of this year, you can just sign up for the mailing list. That's also there on the website, and just stay in touch and kind of see what's going on. Like I said, we've got a couple other initiatives outside of the event that we're already starting to think about. We've got this like automation maturity framework that we're starting to work on with some of the folks. We've got kind of a net DevOps handbook / kind of automation framework we're working on to help kind of give a blueprint for folks who are trying to get started. So hopefully we'll be publishing some cool kind of community driven documents, and we'll publish ways to get involved in those over that mailing list in time. And like I said, we'll probably invite everybody on the mailing list into a Slack channel at some point soon as well. Just because people prefer that sometimes over email. So we'll figure it out. And like I said, I think the main thing right now is register for the event, sign up for the mailing list, and then let us know what you want to see, because this is the time to kind of shape the Network Automation Forum into what you need it to be. Because that's really the idea, is to serve the industry and the broader network engineering community, to make sure that we're helping in any way we can to move this all forward.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I'll definitely be looking out for the next. I cannot make it to the November. I learned about your event too late. I already have some work planned, but I'll look out for the next one, and maybe I can participate. I'm definitely interested into all of this, as I spend most of my time doing it nowadays. So
yeah,
it's and I don't know if are you thinking of having different tracks maybe in the future. I know, like, I focus a lot on Wi-Fi, so most of the automation is around that. But do you find, like, you have, like, in the industry, people focusing more on network security versus just like core network versus wireless? Like, what do you see?
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I think, potentially there's something of size in it, and kind of purpose of networks, right? As the kind of the really coarse grain, right? So service provider versus enterprise. Of course, big enough enterprises, depending on how they're built, end up looking like service providers in a lot of cases, because they're serving multiple business units and that kind of thing. But there's kind of that split, and then definitely within that, I think you're right. I think security is a huge part of this. I think Wi-Fi is a big part of this. I think, like I said, interconnection is the thing that's near and dear to me, that I think needs a lot more attention in automation. And there's kind of the LAN versus WAN. So there's definitely a lot of ways to split this. There's also kind of the business track versus technical track, which I think could be a split too, where there may be some folks who come in that are managers or folks that have more budgetary control, that really want to drive this at their organization. Maybe they're not hands on the keyboard anymore, but they want to find a way to kind of break some of these barriers down. And so having a full on, business track might make sense as well. So it's all on the table right now. Like I said, a big part of the first event is going to be getting feedback from folks and seeing where the zeitgeist kind of takes us. We're trying to do, like I said, one big single track to start with, have one conversation and get all that feedback, give everyone takeaways on things they can do to help automate their networks as they leave the conference. And then definitely, open to all kinds of ideas in the future for how we can continue to grow and make it better.
Yeah, I think one challenge you may have for the event is you may have people that have a lot of experience and they want to kind of showcase what they've learned and maybe share their challenges and propose some solutions. But you may also have some people that are just interested about it but have never done it before. So they might kind of be lost if they kind of, watching a presentation of someone that's been spending the last 5 years working on it. So maybe you'll have to kind of find the balance and in for the event and see how it goes. But that's
absolutely
interesting.
Yeah, we're also talking about we're figuring out how we're going to set up some like affinity groups or birds of a feather that other conferences have done a really good job with, where we'll be able to have some kind of smaller conversations that go on maybe during the breakfast and lunch breaks or during the kind of half day on Monday before the conference really ramps up and starts. And I think I've always found that the hallway track, so to speak, is as valuable at most conferences as anything else. And so we really want to foster that as well. We're trying to make sure we have a good amount of downtime and break time for people to meet each other, exchange business cards, exchange email addresses, whatever it is, so that those new folks can find mentors that they can learn from and call upon when they need help, and really kind of energize the community in that way as well.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I think we presented the event quite a bit. Do you have anything to add, Chris? Did we forget anything?
No, we definitely covered it really well. I mean, there was one thing, just circling back to kind of something you talked about a little earlier. One of the ideas my partner, Scott Roban, and me have been talking about is this idea of like an internal automation evangelist inside of a company. A gentleman I talked to, this guy, Eddie Chan at Nordstrom, is kind of doing that role there, where basically they're kind of, what do they call that? Like a center of excellence. And they kind of go around to all the other departments and all the other groups, because in a lot of big companies, there's actually more than one networking group, right? And each one may be choosing different ways to do automation even. So, even automation can be non-standardized. And so, having that focal point where somebody's coming along and saying, no, you know what, at least within this company, we're going to do things this way. We're going to use, GNMI and NetConf and blah, 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 and do things that way. And kind of creating that standardization inside of an organization can be powerful, and spreading the word of, the gospel of automation inside of a network team as well. So that's just an interesting side note. I think, this can happen at kind of the industry level, but also within a company. I think that evangelism is something that's super interesting.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see, because that's what we would normally call, was that shadow IT? I guess it's now shadow automation.
Right. Exactly. So how do you kind of pull all that together and make sure everybody's, swimming the same way, and cross team too, right? I've definitely seen some really interesting decisions made where, oh, well, the server guys were using Puppet, so we just started using Puppet for the network. Well, it may not work quite as well. I mean, it's cool to have standardization, but you can also take it too far sometimes too, where maybe some things don't actually work that way. So being able to kind of have those porous, break down those silos and have folks talk to each other about what's working and what's not is inside the organizations, I think is going to be really important.
Awesome. It's going to sound like a good event.
Yeah, you'll have to come back after the event to give us your debrief.
For sure. Yeah, happy to.
Maybe we can do that. Okay, Chris. So where can people find you if they want to get in touch with you online?
Yeah, on Twitter at Chris Grundemann, although I'm using that less and less. LinkedIn, I think, is where a lot of X. That's right. I forget even the name. LinkedIn is a great place to find me, just Chris Grundemann. I'm also online, chrisgrundemann.com. And then, like I said, everything for AutoCon 0 is up at networkautomation.forum.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll add that to the show notes.
Sweet.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for your time. Thank you guys for listening. And I guess we'll be back for the next episode in a bit. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Need a Wi-Fi scanner and survey tool that won't kill your budget? Try Wi-Fi Scanner for Windows. It's an all-in-one tool to explore Wi-Fi access points, test speed, and perform active and passive surveys. Built by Wi-Fi engineers for Wi-Fi engineers. Visit wifiscanner.com to start your free trial today.